Uh, the title is, I hope, self-explanatory. If we could start with an extract from Bell's Life in London, which was the sporting paper of the Victorian era. From these extracts from 22nd of May 1842, you can see two bare-knuckle prize fighters offering to wager quite substantial amounts of money in a fight, £50 a side. That's perhaps £6,000 a side in today's money. This is an image from the 1820s of a prize fight. You may think it's slightly better organized than you imagined. A lot of bare-knuckle fights, obviously, were behind the pub on a Saturday night, very brutal affairs. The organized so-called official prize ring was perhaps no less brutal, but it was better organized. One little surprising thing, as you can see, there are 6 people in the ring, the 2 fighters, the 2 bottle men, and the two seconds, or knee men as they were called sometimes. Outside the ring, in the outer ring, you had a timekeeper. Each fighter had an umpire. If they couldn't agree, you also had a referee. So there were quite a few people involved, and a certain amount of organization was required. There were rules, but not very many. There were no gloves, obviously. Punching was allowed, but so also was wrestling. For example, as you can see on the left-hand side, throwing your opponent was a good tactic. And if you could then fall on top of him as well, that was even better. The tactic on the right is the ultimate in bare-knuckle fighting. You manage to get your opponent round the neck with your left arm, and then you beat him into a pulp with your fist, your right fist. So it wasn't anyone of a delicate disposition might want to log off at this point. Fights were illegal. Merely by being present, you could be guilty of conduct likely to lead to a breach of the peace. The fighters themselves obviously would be guilty of assault, battery, perhaps grievous bodily harm, and in an extreme case, if your opponent died, that was manslaughter. None of this, however, this illegality stopped the prize ring flourishing. 2 factors were important in counterbalancing the illegality. One was the aristocratic and upper class approval that the sport had from the 18th century. And the other factor, perhaps equally important, is the forces of law and order were often rudimentary or sometimes non-existent. In Leeds, our police and magistrates were fairly strongly anti-fight. So you had to pitch your ring at some secluded or solitary spot. Bramham Moor in the early days was a favourite spot. And in fact, it was here that a fight took place which gave Leeds a brief national notoriety. You can see from the headline, brutal treatment of magistrate at fight. A local magistrate, one William Markham of Aberford, heard that a prize fight was taking place near the Bramham crossroads, and with perhaps more courage than discretion, climbed into the ring in the middle of the fight in front of about 1,000 spectators, commanded them to stop. As you might not be surprised to hear, he was then hit on the head and retired hurt himself. The boxers carried on to the end of their fight, and then for 60 rounds, in fact, and then departed. Meanwhile, that morning, the Leeds had been emptied of what the local paper called the lovers of blackguardism and brutality. So the Leeds magistrates had dispatched a contingent of the town police, who encountered the winner and various supporters on the road back to Leeds. The fighters in a hackney coach, flying ribbons and celebrating. Several arrests were made. In fact, bare-knuckle fights were often a scene of great festivity for the population. Here's a famous etching from earlier in the century of spectators returning from the fight in a rather merry and boisterous mood. The Bramham spectators and fighters weren't so merry. Those who had assaulted the magistrate got 12 months inside, and the fighters themselves actually got a month imprisonment. There are other examples, just one more. On a Monday morning in October 1838, a, quote, number of blackguards, unquote, the words of the local paper, assembled for a prize fight on Colton Common near Seacroft. The Leeds police again got wind of this and, as they say, proceeded to Seacroft. The crowd scattered, but later the police came across one of the fighters and his seconds, who had unwisely stopped for refreshments at a pub on the York Road. They were arrested by Inspector Child, and they ended up being bound over to keep the peace for 6 months. Effectively, that keeps you out of the ring and out of trouble for 6 months. Then you start again. So you may ask yourself, why did the authorities not read Bell's life and arrest the principals before the fight took place? Well, sometimes they did. There's a good example, an exciting incident in 1843 in Wakefield. 2 Leeds fighters had agreed to fight near Huddersfield on the Wednesday. On the Tuesday, the police, as they say, acting on information received, i.e. they probably read the newspapers, proceeded to the Ship Inn in Kirgate and Wakefield. Inspector Child to the fore. He was the man who made the arrest at Seacroft a few years earlier. Inspector Child arrested Clarkson, who was due to fight the following day. He was immediately surrounded by 40 drinkers in an ugly mood. Inspector Child drew 2 pistols and threatened to stop anyone who tried to obstruct him in the course of his duty, successfully abstracted Clarkson from the pub, and he in due course was bound over for 12 months. So, but on balance, there was a gentleman's agreement between the fighting people and the police that if they arrived when the fight was about to take place, the fighting men would quietly and politely dismantle their ring and move off and set it up somewhere else, usually just over the boundary of the police area. And there is if you can read that, that's an example of how it worked in practice. You can see here the fight is at Brotherton Marsh, which is near Ferrybridge. The Beaks, the magistrates, discover what's happening. The fight and the spectators move to Burton's Salmon, the police, the magistrates catch up with them. So they pacifically move on to Monk Fryston, have their fight there, and honour is satisfied on all sides. The police and magistrates have stopped the fight taking place in their area, but everyone has had their fight and they can go home happy. The prize ring, as I've said, was illegal in its operation, but in Leeds, as in other cities, particularly in the north, it was a thriving all year round sport. Professional fighters went about their business and largely ignored by respectable society. They were also ignored by the mainstream press, and perhaps for that reason, they have been ignored by local historians, which is my excuse for subjecting you to this little bit of research. The elements of a sport, albeit illegal, but still a organized sport, you need supporters, organizers. The trade term for that is the fancy. Everyone involved, fighters, trainers, backers, bettors, fans, and the merely curious are the fancy, those who follow the sport. We have some detailed figures from 1847. There were 113 official PR events in England that year. £44,000 was staked, say £500,000 in today's money. Leeds that year was about fourth in English towns. We had £322 fought for in Leeds in 1847, which is somewhere between a third and a half of the Manchester total. And it was definitely a place on the prize ring circuit. Communication is necessary for a sport, a functioning sport, and as we've seen, the newspapers reported past events and advertised future events. You had to have a venue for organizing the sport from. The actual fights, as we see, were peripatetic. They moved around, but you had to have a fixed place from which you could organize the fights. These were called sporting houses. Everything was these were in fact pubs, and everything was organized through pubs effectively. A fighter would issue a challenge. Perhaps it would get into Bell's life, as we saw on the second screen. That would stipulate where they would meet to arrange the details, the amount to be staked, the place of the fight, the time, all the details. These sporting houses existed in London from the middle of the 18th century when the sport began. We can't tell what the first sporting houses in Leeds were. The earliest one that I've found is called the Weaver's Arms in Mill Street, and that's mentioned back in 1831. And that's where you would go if you're a member of the fancy. It was very importantly also where you found out where the next fight was going to be, Bramham Moor or Seacroft or Huddersfield or wherever it was. Also, publicans expanded. They would invite fighters in, and you would have personal appearances and a bit of sparring. And generally it was the a very convenient, it was where you went to socialize and perhaps carouse with your fellow fancy members. Something about a few Leeds pugilists who have been ignored by history. The local press didn't write them up. They didn't get obituaries. They didn't leave any diaries, unfortunately. They didn't even tell the census enumerators what they did for a living. So it's difficult to find out much about their background. But oh yes, this is where you might go to meet one of your sporting heroes. This is one possible view of a sporting house in the 1820s. Not the most salubrious, perhaps. The chap in the front right is, you may be able to see, reading his copy of Bell's Life to see where next week's fight might be. Anyway, a quick word about some of our forgotten Leeds fighters. William Riley is the first to surfaces. Know nothing of his origins. It's tempting to think that he's part of the Irish influx to Leeds in the early 19th century. He fought between 1835 and 1839. His headquarters, we can deduce, was the Turk's Head on Briggate, which is where he issued challenges and organized his fights. After 1839, he hung around the edges of the PR by being a second and making personal appearances and doing a bit of sparring and so on. His fighting career was effectively ended by the next man on the list, Dick Holmes. He was from Birstall, but had settled in Leeds by 1840. Holmes beat Riley in one of the great fights of the period. It was for £50 a side, say 10 or 12,000 quid to the winner. The fancy made their way from Leeds to Middleham. The magistrates spotted lots of sporting looking characters, shall we say, around Middleham. So the whole cavalcade moved off to Jervaux Abbey, and the fight took place in the grassy sward beside the abbey. Holmes won in 20 rounds and established a mid-level national reputation. Tommy Smith was the other of the was the second of the best of the Leeds fighters. Born about 1820 in Leeds, gained an early reputation and had some good fights, and alongside Dick Holmes, as we'll see in a moment, became one of the great entrepreneurs of boxing and fighting in Leeds. He was known as the Checker Lad because his base originally was the Checker Inn in Marshall Street in Holbeck. The pub doesn't survive, though if you look to the top of that directory, you'll see some pubs do survive from that period, including the Cardigan Arms I just noticed on Kirkstall Road, but that's the exception. Tommy Smith was famous. He had a fight with James Russell of Manchester on Snake Pass in summer 1842. They fought for an hour and a quarter and 53 rounds. Russell didn't come up for the 54th round, was carried away by his seconds and died the following day. This was a not uncommon happening, and regrettably, in bare knuckle fighting. Smith was convicted of manslaughter, the usual verdict, at Derby Assizes in August and received a sentence which again was not unusual, a little bit generous. It was 1 month in prison. The usual tariff was about 3 months. So within 5 months, he was out again, taking benefits, appearing in sporting pubs. And by the summer of 1843, that's the following year, he was in London. He was getting backing from the big London money backers. It's worth mentioning his one of his London fights. You couldn't fight inside London, obviously, the police would stop you. But his fight in 1843 took what was a not unusual course. They hired a steamer on the Thames and filled the boat with punters at 10 shillings a go, steamed down the Thames, disembarked on the Essex shore, erected the ring. The police arrived over the marshes and said, you can't do that here. So they all very peaceably dismantled the ring, got back on the Thames steamer and crossed to the Kent side, had their fight there, and then got back in the boat and were all back in the centre of London by 10 o'clock that evening, all very well refreshed, no doubt, from a whole day drinking on the boat and watching a fight, etc. Oops. Say a word about sparring, the respectable side of the prize ring. Professional fighters had to make money outside the ring. You couldn't fight all the time. So from the beginning, boxers gave exhibitions. Sparring with gloves was not illegal unless it led to a breach of the peace, which did happen occasionally. The posh version of that, if you look at the left-hand side there, in 1824, Tom Spring and the ex-champion Tom Cribb went on a grand tour of the country and were in Leeds, as you can see, in May 1824 at the theatre, giving a sparring exhibition between the two of them. They also took on, as you can see, some of the local amateurs. Amazingly popular, they appeared on 2 nights. They were said to have made £100 between them. In other words, a 5-figure sum. And they'd been in Newcastle, they were going to Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, etc. So you didn't need to have your head bashed in the ring necessarily in order to make money. When sporting houses became established in the 1820s, 1830s, sparring migrated into the sporting houses, the pubs, and they became quite organized in the end. You could have local fighters fighting, and they would be paid perhaps by throwing pennies at them. At a slightly higher level, local star fighters would appear, or visiting celebrity fighters would appear. And for events like that, you would buy a ticket, and quite a lot of money was made by some of the entrepreneurs. And who were these? Oh, this, by the way, is from the Regency period in London. This is a very high-class bit of sparring going on in the tennis court, with local celebrities pictured in front. Not quite as palatial in Leeds. These are our sparring rooms in Leeds. The period is the 1840s and 50s. As you can see, there were three entrepreneurs, essentially. Tommy Smith, you remember the man who killed Russell, the Manchester fighter, on Snake Pass. Dick Holmes, who beat Bill Riley at Revo Abbey. And down at the bottom, I won't have time to mention the Searles brothers, but they were local fighters and professional pedestrians. As you can see, between 1840 and 1855, there would be 2 or 3 of these major sparring rooms in operation at any one time. Tommy Smith first appeared at his sponsor pub, the Checkers Inn in Holbeck. Later on, he got his own place on Union Street, corner of Nelson Street, which I think is down there where Quarry Hill Flats used to be. Dick Holmes got his own places. Eventually, as you can see, Cole Lane moving to Kergate, moving to Brigate. The Searleses stayed put in Meadow Lane. So we're all, as you can see, in the centre of Leeds. If you wanted to go for a night out with your mates in the fancy, talk about fighting, meet boxers, there's where you went. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, a few other fighters tried to muscle in on this business, but didn't last very long. Better running out of time, so we'll draw this to a conclusion. By, say, 1860, the days of bare knuckle fighting were essentially over. Traditionally, the end is marked by the great Sayers-Heenan fight in 1860. Sayers, the English champion, Heenan, a great American fighter. By then in Leeds, we'd basically seen the end of the PR. We were seeing already the germs or beginnings of mass spectator sports, which took over in the late Victorian period. By 1870, obviously, if you were thinking of seeking out an illegal bare knuckle fight, they did continue, but you wouldn't go. Instead, you would go to see your local, say, rugby league team. Whether you would then describe that as a brutal exhibition or a noble example of self-defense, I leave up to your personal opinion of the sports, and I leave it there. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you, Derek, for showing some light on a dark part of Leeds history about which I think most of us knew nothing before the start of your talk. There have been 3 questions in chat. One I think you've already answered. Barbara asked, were there legal fights alongside prize fighting? And I think what you said about sparring probably answers that.
Yes, that's yeah. That was the only legal form of the prize ring. Yep.
James asked, when there were prize fights, did the spectators pay?
It depended. If you had well-known fighters, you tried to, monetize the event. You would get some very big blokes who would form an outer ring, and you would allow spectators within the ring for 5 bob, 10 bob a guinea. You could also lease out room for someone's carriage or chaise to be parked near the ring. So it was possible to make some money from spectators, but obviously these fights took place in secluded areas, and it wasn't so easy to extract the money. The hiring a Thames steamer was a good idea. There's one example of a Leeds fighter who, fought a Hull fighter, and between them they chartered a steamer in Hull, steamed down the Humber, disembarked at Immingham, got off, had the fight, and steamed back to Hull. Again, as I've indicated, selling drink and food all the time on the way there and the way back.
And finally, I think we've just time for this last question. Jackie asked, did the fighters receive all the prize money, or was much of it creamed off to the managers?
Often they received none of the money whatsoever. It was entirely, the £50 aside went to the backers who'd funded it. What you hoped for there was to have a benefit after the fight back at the sporting house, and people might pay to come and see or shake your hand, and they would sort of pass the hat round. So it varied. Very few of the fighters had their own funds to put up as part of the wager. Most of them, regrettably, spent the money as soon as they earned it. Oh dear, but such is life.
Thank you very much, Derek, for that fascinating talk. I think we'll take up your provocative remarks about rugby league on another occasion. So can I just end the meeting by echoing the thoughts of many people who are typing thanks to all three speakers into the chat for taking the time to prepare and deliver such interesting talks.